So good evening, everyone. It's an honor to welcome you all to this virtual roundtable event, Building Science Communicators from the Ground Up, Why and How, hosted by the DST Center for Policy Research at the University of Hyderabad. So the DST CPR at UoH is an initiative by the Department of Science and Technology under GOI. The DST has been tasked with formulating and implementing public policy support to promote science, technology, and innovation within the country. As part of its policy research cell program, DST has established CPRs to pursue policy-based research in identified thematic areas of different S&T sectors. Currently, there are 8 DST centers for policy research and 10 DST satellite centers for policy research across India. So the DST CPR at the University of Hyderabad was established in April 2023 with 3 broad goals. First is to study technology-led entrepreneurship. Second is to study industry-academia interaction, public-private partnership, and technology transfer. And third is science communication and public engagement. The project is coordinated by Professor G.S. Prasad, and the co-PIs are Professor Usha Raman and Professor Raghav Reddy. I'm Shrestha. I'm a research associate with Professor Raman at DST CPR UoH. Currently, our work is on public engagement in S&T policy and science communication. Professor Raman is also our moderator for today. And regarding the event, we are gathered here today to initiate a dialogue that spans across disciplines in an era defined by rapid technological advancements that shape our daily lives. The intersection of science and society warrants a very close examination. Science communication has been an important practice that bridges the gap between these two spheres. Beyond the dedicated SciComm and public engagement professionals, there has always been an inherent need for scientists to directly engage with the public. Research shows that scientists in India do have great enthusiasm, but there are substantial barriers that are stopping them, like the lack of training or lack of institutional support. It is important now more than ever to expand the reach of science communication training and work towards capacity building that enables greater public science engagement. Our event brings together distinguished scientists, academics, and science communicators to discuss the feasibility of integrating SciComm training as part of STEM education in India and to explore the learnings from SciComm best practices. So let's get ready for a brainstorming session where we try to get ideas and feedback and try to bring together the logic of our 2 brilliant panels. And the format for today's event is the first panel will contain scientists and educators, followed by a brief intermission around 5:30 p.m. and then a second panel with science communicators. Before I hand it over to Professor Usha Raman, I'd like to briefly introduce our first panel. Detailed introductions, I'll put them in the chat so you can find them. Our first panelist is Professor Prajval Shastri, who's a scientist, astrophysicist, and emeritus professor at Raman Research Institute. Next, we have Dr. V.V. Binoy, who's an associate professor and in charge of the science communication program at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. Then we have Professor Sharath Anantha, who's a physicist and professor at the School of Physics, University of Hyderabad. Then we have Dr. Ponnari Gottipati, who is the Associate Director of Research Management at L.V. Prasad Eye Institute in Hyderabad. Dr. Aalok Khandekar is the Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Sociology at the Department of Liberal Arts, Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. Now over to our moderator today, who's Professor Usha Raman, Head, Department of Communication at UoH. Thank you.
Thank you, Shrestha, for setting the context and for the introductions. And thanks everybody for being here, particularly the panelists. I know many of you may have actually engaged in similar discussions in other fora, but I think clearly, we haven't solved the problem, so it's important for us to continue talking about it. So what we're talking about here today is not really new. I think everybody on both panels, scientists, science educators, science communicators, and those who study the institution of science, specifically here I'm talking about Aalok, all have thought about this at some point. Perhaps when struggling with a presentation on complex research findings being communicated to a group of policymakers, or when writing the introduction that sets the context for a large grant application, or when you want to counter the load of misinformation related to the problem area that you work within, you want to write an editorial to counter it, perhaps, right? or even when you're trying to enthuse a group of young high schoolers about research in your field. Communication clearly is key to making science not only relevant to the broader public and to funders, but also to feed into policy mechanisms and, of course, innovation, development, and deployment. However, it's always been seen either as something so basic that we don't really need to pay attention to it, or that it can be called upon from some internal tool chest when we need to. Or, of course, that we can just delegate it to somebody else, maybe a non-scientist who doesn't have to be preoccupied with the more important task of actually doing science. But clearly that hasn't solved the problem of really getting good science out to the public in the way that we as scientists would like to. So, so this panel is really to pick your brains a little bit on thinking about what the gaps are, what your experiences have been, and how we might use that understanding to inform and advocate for science communication training within graduate programs in STEM areas, rather than it having to be an add-on at some later stage in one's career. So, I know that we have a very tight schedule, so we'll go ahead and get started. And I would request each of the panelists to take about 8 to 10 minutes at most to make some opening remarks, maybe laying out the problem from your perspective, and so that it gives us a little bit of time for discussion after that. So we'll start with Prajval Shastri. And Shrestha, as she said, we'll be putting the bios in the chat so that we don't need to spend too much time with introductions during the session. So Prajval, can I ask you to start?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real privilege and a thrill to be part of this. So one of the things that I was asked to address is that how would I emphasize the importance of the topic at hand? So firstly, I would like to emphasize the obligation. It was implied by the Science and Technology Policy of India of 1958 that as science professors and as science researchers, we have an obligation to engage on science with the citizenry. Secondly, you ask anyone who has seriously thought about science praxis in the context of knowledge being a public good, science being the institutionalization of the scientific method, which is self-correcting, therefore the best we have to understand the world around us. They will tell you that the 3 pillars of science praxis are knowledge creation or research, teaching and capacity building, and public engagement. So the word pillars is important. So public engagement is not an add-on. And that's actually quite consistent with the science and technology policy. And thirdly, from a selfish point of view of the science practitioner, engagement with a variety of lay audiences actually deepens our own understanding, just as teaching deepens our understanding. So public engagement is not about, we the brilliant dishing out knowledge to the so-called common people, but public engagement is a two-way street. And so science communication becomes meaningful and effective only in that framework, really. So what are the gaps in the current situation? So there is certainly a huge science literacy deficit among our citizenry, including among scientists, unfortunately. So examples that are testimony to this is how the citizenry, even highly educated citizenry, enthusiastically embrace technology, such as cell phones or ultrasound fetal diagnosis, and cheer the success of Chandrayaan, but huddle indoors in fear when eclipses happen. So there are a few things I wish to highlight, a few gaps. The first is that science practitioners, in my experience, by and large, simply do not see themselves as supported by the taxpayer and therefore obligated to the taxpayer. Instead, our mindset is, and I think we are willy-nilly taught this mindset, is that we are brilliant and therefore we practice science. So this mindset clearly needs to be dismantled because it is contrary to fact. It completely discounts the very significant role of privileged backgrounds, privileged access to education and opportunities that actually make people successful in science. The second gap, is there a problem? Should I continue? Or?
Yeah, please continue. Yeah, sorry. I think there was some other background. Yeah.
Okay. So the second gap is that this framework of the three pillars of science practice, namely knowledge creation, teaching, and public engagement, does not, in fact, exist. On the contrary, there is a deliberate and strong hierarchy being imposed on research, teaching, and public engagement. So the brilliant do research, the next brilliant do teaching, and the least brilliant do engagement. In fact, I would say that I spend something like 10% of my time in engaging lay audiences about science, and that was actually looked down upon in my institution. And I think the structure, therefore, needs to be rehauled, and the mandate of scientists or professors, etc., should be redefined to speak to all these three pillars. The third gap that I want to highlight is that whatever public engagement does happens in the hierarchical, we the brilliant, you the common people framework, which perforce falsely portrays science as something difficult that only the brilliant can do. And the fact is that excelling in anything, whether it's football or dance or financial management, is not easy and requires scientific thinking. It requires hard work to drill, to hone skills. It requires commitment, passion. The problem is that exceptionalizing science leads to false definitions or flawed definitions of merit and creates exclusion, discrimination on gender, on caste lines, and also other lines, both within science and among the lay audiences of science. So therefore, professors, scientists, and science leaders do need to be educated so that they don't falsely portray science as something difficult that only the brilliant can do. And there is a current trend, especially in well-funded elite science institutions in the country, of funding outreach programs. At least in astrophysics, it's become very common, and they've come around to taking it seriously from a purely utilitarian perspective of wanting to attract more students who are desperately needed. But they typically hire full-time staff and palm off the third pillar to those staff. And what I'm saying is, yes, there needs to be investment in full-time outreach personnel, but their job should be to conceive, to coordinate public engagement programs, to ensure equity and inclusion among audiences, and their important job should be to critique the scientists and professors in how they do that outreach. So the actual engagement must be done by the science practitioners. And finally, the challenge is the science deficit that plagues scientific institutions. Even institutions that view themselves as top class, like IISc, have scientists who, for whom science research is only a livelihood and not a way of life or a way of thinking. And partly because our hiring processes don't give any importance to that. And so public engagement becomes all about the accomplishments and achievements of science, laced with a good bit of chest thumping and who got where first, rather than about how we know, what are the processes, what were the journeys, what are the pitfalls, and what were the barriers. So about science communication in curricula, if done meaningfully, of course, the opportunities are immense because it will open the door to dialogue at various levels. It will empower the public to hold publicly funded scientific institutions accountable. But science communication cannot be taught in the obedience framework. And to be meaningful, it needs to be a questioning framework. The obedience framework only comes in the way, which is the framework that is typically in educational institutions. Science is not just about seeking the truth, which is not unique to science, but about the willingness to change conclusions in the face of evidence. And it's about being curious and not fearful about the unknown. So the specific gaps are that science practitioners need to treat science communication with respect, recognize it as their obligation and one of the 3 pillars of our praxis, which means we need to change our hiring practices. And honestly, I do not think that science communication should be seen as an add-on in curricula. The truth is that our science curriculum is highly ossified and our methods are not just outdated, but again, based in the brilliance framework. So the methods are exclusionary. And if that is corrected, and we learn science in modern and engaging ways using modern pedagogical insights in regional languages, etc., we will not actually need a separate science communication curriculum. So in other words, the goals that I talked about earlier should be the goals not of science communication in the curriculum, but of science teaching itself. So science should be taught not in an obedience framework, but in ways that fosters and indeed demands questioning and builds curiosity rather than the fear of the unknown. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Prajval. I think you've nicely laid it out. Now, some of these critiques have been brought from outside of science, and rarely do we see them from within the science establishment. So I think it's great that you've started out with that critique, and based on that critique are offering some suggestions. So we'll go to the next speaker, who is VV Binoy. Binoy, can I ask you to come
Hello,
on?
can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor Shastri, for setting up the discussion. So what I will do that, I will build on her arguments so that it's easy to continue the discussion. So from I will start with my experiences, because I joined NIAS as a researcher, and decided to become a professional researcher. But I got a passion for science communication, and we started some work. We did some work at formal level, informal level, for policymakers, public, and through this experience, I learned a lot, and I experienced a lot in Hotel God. And now we have this program, dedicated program for science communication. 6 students are doing PhD in that. So I'm following the structure given by the organizers. So first of all, I thank Dr. Usha Raman and the team for inviting me and giving me a chance for sharing my experiences. So starting from where Professor Shastri said, there is no difference about the public trust in science. Because, people always look for science when there is uncertainty, like we saw in the case of COVID-19. So the major question was, where is the vaccine? Why the vaccine is not coming? Where is the science? Why the scientists are not able to do that and all? But if you see the transition happening in the science-society relationship, if you have some interest in social science also, you might have seen that the agreement between science and society is changing. First, because the system is changing. Second, because new technologies are coming into the system. So if I can say, in this current system where fake news, social media, synthetic media controls all these things, science cannot be silent and it needs to be communicated in a proper way. Otherwise, it will be utilized by the people with vested interest. And obviously, you can ask, when somebody talks to scientists, they will ask for data. So during our COVID, we conducted a study. We studied how media people in India, Switzerland, and USA, what is the source, most trusted source for media when they are going to communicate about science, communicate about the COVID. So the result is available. I will put that in the comment. That website is called SciComm. You can see that in all these 3 nations, the most dependent source of information was nobody but researchers. So they suggested that either scientists or if the universities are giving the information, we are happy with that. So even media is dependent upon scientists. It means that we have a lot of responsibility to give the science in an undistorted form. If I think from the side of society, generally what happens is that the society sees scientists as magicians. And they feel that they are very well-renowned or well-read people. But we know that all of us have limited knowledge in a specific area. So in this context, crosstalks between the system and a system which specifically work for communicating with public who cannot understand the communication between scientist A and his peer is an essential. And we conducted another study. If you are from some IITs, you might have got the questionnaire 6 months back asking for the science communication preferences of the IIT faculties, ISR faculties, and all that. And we found that the most preferred medium now amongst the academicians are still seminars, talks, and writing. But when you throw the, because I can say, because we are mainly dependent upon or overshadowed by the information deficiency model. We believe that we have information, they don't have information. But when, as a psychologist or a cognitive scientist, when I started to analyze science communication, I found that none of the minds are tabula rasa. That means blank slate. So when you throw in information, they also try to make sense of that. And the study shows that there is a difference between sense making of a scientific information by public and by a learned person. And the duty of the communicator comes in between this, trying to help the public to sense make the information or scientifically sense make the information and stop them from the everyday sense making, that making sense of that information in some way. That's not an easy business because you have to have a strong knowledge of the community, strong knowledge of their knowledge synthesis, strong knowledge of their system and all that. So if we talk about how to incorporate this in science education system, so we need to consider 3 criteria. One is scientists who generate the knowledge. Second is scientist communicators, scientists who is communicating their findings in their own language. Then communicator who gets the information and share it with the public. And fourth group, that is academicians who is dependent upon textbook, either written by their peers or by some other scientific scientists. So here what you have to say that in many of the contexts, what happened that we follow the information deficiency model and we tell that you throw the information and don't leave it there. So recently I was having a discussion with a scientist from some of the leading organizations in India focusing on health research. I asked, do you follow your tweet? Do you try to understand how the tweets are received? So then there itself we did an experiment using Facebook. And we took around 10 leading scientists who tweets in the system. And we found that the major people liking their tweets are either their peers or their friends. So the system is that there is another filter bubble. When we discovered science communication, what happened that this science communication discussion is also continuing in this filter bubble. We need to break that. So what we need to do that if you are planning to incorporate these ideas into science education curriculums, you need to think about moving from science communication as an art to science communication as a science. You need to understand, like a scientist does, how the system receives the information, how the system processes the information, how the system utilizes that information when a technical decision-making scenario comes, how the system is not accepting certain information and rejecting that information. And another big issue, if you go to undergraduate education system, because I worked with college teachers and myself as a science teacher in my college in 1 year, what science is never discussed in the background of the society. So science, I still remember when I was working in Mizoram, one girl asked me, she was in 9th standard, not undergraduate student, why I am studying photosynthesis, mathematics, and all these things. Because there itself, it is not connected, and they are not able to integrate that information. So we need to find that. And when you are going to integrate, one of the resistance is often expected is from the teachers because they don't want to change the syllabus because there is an existing system and they are overloaded. We will say that why don't you spend 2 hours for teaching science to the public? It never happens because that is an additional 2 or 3 hours for their system. So in that case, we need to think about how we can converge the idea of science communication with media literacy, which is being extensively discussed in the context of fake news. We need to discuss how it can be with a part of formal education system, how the system is going to accept it if you are coming out as a new system. Or if you are thinking about informal settings, we have a project called Student Scientists where we try to connect schools of an area with a college and that college school network, we are connecting with science communicators, science educators, that kind of system. Even there also we are getting a lot of, the system don't work in the way which we decide, because different communities have different needs, different students are have different needs. So need to think about how we can start integrating the science education in science education curricula itself. That would be one of the stage we should be start thinking. Then we need to think about how communication, especially science communication, can use as a tool to bring connection between different subjects like STEM, coming under the broad umbrella of STEM. And most importantly, now industry also wants science communicators. So when a PhD student, you can see the difference between the science communication ecosystem happening in a academic setup and a college setup, or a research setup and a college setup, where both of the cases they are communicating, but in academic setup, that is for the teachers, they communicate. The entire education system is based on communication in India, correct? So they are preparing the college students are preparing it for teachers. At the same time, the academicians are preparing it are communicating with their peers only. Now we need to connect these things. And most importantly, we need to bring the idea how we can use this information integrated with how we can integrate with the syllabus. If you are coming out with a new plugin, there is a very high chance that people are not going to accept it. So I will finish in 1 minute. For instance, there is a lot of project-based learning. But very rarely the project-based learning system talks about communication. You come out with a project, you end up with a report. So to conclude, what I'm saying is that we need a multi-stakeholder approach, because many times when you go for an informal setting, you will not have any idea about what is going to happen in that college. So in that scenario, we are getting support of NGOs. Think about formal, informal training programs. Think about plain language summaries, which is being actively asked by the journals now. So students are also compelled to come out with plain language summary, even though they are hardcore researchers. So there is gaps with potential. We need to find out these kind of gaps and generate the material which integrates with the system without leading to any conflict between the people who are trying to bring the science communication into the existing curriculum. So that's all from my side for the time being.
Thank you so much, Binoy. And I think you pivoted in some ways. You've built on what Prajval said, which was also to recognize the politics and the culture of science, but approached it from a curriculum mindset in some senses. So thank you for that. So can we now move to Sharath, if you've sorted your network problems? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for your patience. And just when I was about to log in, our internet crashed. And so my students valiantly rescued my efforts by providing me a dongle, but then we have it restored back. So thank you. I'm sorry I missed Prajval's initial remarks. So I would have to ask her later what she said. So my response cannot be in a way to what she has said, but then I guess we'll have an opportunity to do it. And Prasad Binoy, I just heard speak. So my experience about science communication comes mainly from teaching, but then which I also regard as a form of science communication, but also through my interaction and engagement in terms of outreach communication programs such as the DST Inspire, of which I've been mentor. I'm often invited to science club activities. And of course, during the COVID time, a lot of these activities happened on the internet, and I've also had opportunities to interacting with both Mofussil rural type of students who come from mainly vernacular backgrounds, as well as the more urban settings and more elite schools. So that's so whatever I say in the next few minutes is going to be with this background as a communicator, and also what I've heard as being in the audience also with, for example, either on panels that, with other heads of research organizations such as ISRO, DAE, or also in the audience when they are talking about their institutions and what facilities they offer and so on. I just wanted to make some remarks on something that I think are two sort of main modes here, which I've sort of discerned over these years. One is what I call the performance mode, where you basically have a dazzling array of presentations. They're often drawn from very interesting and fancy-looking results from one's own research or from the colleagues or communities' research. They also involve often mega projects with billion-dollar budgets. And the content is largely technoscience oriented, the fruits of technology and all the fanciful things that we can aim for in the next century as technology. Then there is another kind of presentation, which is more, I would call the discursive kind. And often these are drawn mainly from the concepts and fundamental ideas of science, such as, for example, an argument based on Darwinian evolution. Or in physics, I often find that the type of talks are much more philosophical in their orientation when you go to things related to quantum mechanics or the uncertainty principle, relativity, space-time, and stuff like that. And in these, I've again seen that there are two kinds of modes. The reason I'm saying this is because I think this influences in large how the public receives notions about science. And one is what I call the rock music concert mode, where the wow factor, the dazzling wow factor is very predominantly brought out. So there are these, what you may call, say, tropes of high technology that are presented, and that's one mode. And another is the kind of the classical kacheri mode, which I say, where the musician takes the audience along. There's the sarhudais along on a musical exploratory landscape. And it's a kind of a self-discovery mode also, where you are actually going along with the communicator in discovering these things through argument, through analogies, examples, and so on. And I think largely public perception of science these days, unfortunately, is predominated by the techno-science presentation modes. And invariably, I've also found that, when we are talking about any new thing coming, for example, quantum information, computing, and things like that, one of the natural things that comes from many of my audience, lay non-scientists, is where was India in all this? And did we not have things similar? Weren't the laws of quantum mechanics already discovered in ancient India and stuff like that? These are also questions that we have to reckon with, but these often also become the breeding grounds for pseudoscience, and a lot of it has sort of stemmed forth in the public imagination. There could also be a colonial issue here, because we've always shown science as something that's happening elsewhere, and the process of discovery is not local enough, at least in the presentations that we make, except of course for some very nice talks which dwell upon things that have happened right in our backyard. So that's a different matter. So I would say that the glitter glamour aspects of science presentations do not help to engage the public critically with science. They only tend to sort of see this as a very esoteric activity removed from our daily going about of things. It's also, in a way, coming from a certain community which has interests, of course, in getting better money garnered to their research or big mega projects being funded. So there, I think I would rather have a sort of a science communication that helps in the pedagogy of the oppressed in a manner of loosely speaking, in that public should become critically aware, and so that they know what they're receiving, and they know where to say, hey, that doesn't look right, or this is just serving a certain community, or this is not good for the environment. So I think public perception of science needs to be formed from a kind of discursive, argumentative method of communicating science. And if that doesn't happen, we are just, left with officials talking about their great big things happening and with mega funding, and that doesn't really help to engage the public in a meaningful way, except to esotericize the domain of scientific activity further, and furthermore also make it seem like a very uncool activity, because that's also something that children these days are put off by, the image of isolated scientists just working away without any communication with the real world. So this largely, so in a way, I would say that going back to the very old C.P. Snow's dichotomy that he raised so well, I think we are taking C.P. Snow's remark a little too literally, in the sense that when he bemoans that, the public is unaware of the second law of thermodynamics, and they should know it just as well as Shakespeare, I think that there's an issue. They don't need to know the second law. They just need to know the processes that increase disorder, and why disorder is something that's occurring in nature. So for that, they need to be educated about the processes going on. So I think discursive communication, more like chats and little, small gatherings where you have a discussion, you take them along with you, is something that I find more useful as a science communicator. So these are my remarks, and thank you for lending me over here.
Thank you. So that reminds me of, the famous Faraday lectures, right, which aim to really bring people into the back room of science, so to speak. So so how that operates in our contemporary media culture and absence of public discourse, in some senses, we'll have to think through that. Thank you, Sharath. So we'll move on to our last two speakers in this segment. The next speaker is Ponnari Gottipati from LV Prasad Institute, and following her is Aalok. And in some senses, we're making a slight shift from people who are teaching, researching science within the establishment of science to people who are, of course, practicing science, but in different ways, and probably thinking about it also differently. So, Ponnari, can I ask you to come on?
Yeah, thank you, Usha. That was a very interesting discussion. Thank you for making me a part of this. But I would like to actually start with a disclaimer, saying that I have actually not involved I've never been involved in formal science education as such. And so whatever insights I'm going to bring to this table today are through my experiences in informal science education, through science education SciComm initiatives that I've been a part of, and through various voluntary activities that I've done in the sphere of science education. And of course, being a researcher myself. So I actually wanted to, again, start off by saying that my interest in STEM subjects and my career choices have largely been influenced by SciComm, I would say. Yeah, in fact, I think I'm a product of one of those, because I remember in my 11th or 12th standard CBSE textbook had these little snippets, very interesting short poems on, different molecular biological techniques like cloning and gene editing, which were just this technology that was just coming up then. And the poems really grabbed my attention. I was just so intrigued by the way the poems were written about these techniques. And then I read up more about that subject, and that is how I ended up doing my undergraduate in biotechnology, and later on pursued my PhD in molecular biology. So that, I think, for me is my personal experience of the how important science communication is in inspiring the next generation of scientists. So that was just a personal anecdote from my side to start off with. In terms of the topic for today, I'm just building on what the previous speakers have said. I remember reading somewhere that scientists value communication when its goal was to defend science from misinformation and educate the public. However, they do not prioritize communication when its goal was to build trust and resonance with the public. And I think whatever we saw during COVID-19, the fallout of this is what we saw during the response of the public to COVID-19 pandemic, or the response of public to climate change or vaccine hesitancy, all of that. So in my opinion, science communication and public engagement, they need to be a continuous process. And like the previous speakers have said, and Dr. Prajval mentioned, it has to be a two-way process instead of a one-way process. Because otherwise, I think the infrequent and ineffective discourse, I think, leads to these kind of SciComm failures. And therefore, there is a need to train scientists in these skills, because one of the major challenges that I see in my experience is that there is no training in communication skills to scientists. And the result is that scientists are not always adequately prepared with the practical skills that are necessary to co-create knowledge with people from non-science backgrounds or people from non-scientific disciplines. And basically, it is the scientists that are losing out in that. I can give an example of this from the health sciences background. Working at LV Prasad Eye Institute, this is a common discourse that we have nowadays, that traditionally in clinical research, clinical trials have always looked at physiological endpoints and clinical outcomes of survival and disease progression. And whereas, talking to patients more often reveals that it is actually the everyday challenges of these chronic conditions that affects their quality of life that they care more about. And therefore, involving, patient engagement and involving patients in research right from the beginning sort of, helps scientists come out with more meaningful outcomes for patients. This is one example where that I can give in the area of importance of public engagement, not just as a one-way street, but as a two-way street, as the previous panelists have suggested, and recognizing that even though these people do not have the scientific knowledge, but they do have the lived experience, wealth of knowledge that scientists can gain a lot from. And this is just one example, but there are, I'm sure it is true for any community that you take, and community engagement and having this two-way engagement with communities on different science society issues, I think helps researchers root their research that is more responsive to societal needs and interests. And that for me is the biggest biggest advantage of public engagement and science communication. And like I already mentioned, I think the challenge is that that there is no communication training for scientists, and I see a lot of value in integrating this in the STEM curriculum. And this has multiple advantages, I think, not just in terms of creating more scientists, in terms of, having scientists more adept at communicating their science to different audiences and co-creating knowledge with different communities. But also, I mean, even for professionals, I mean, who do not end up in academia, but who take on other courses like, say, journalism or, other courses like myself, for example, research management and all, I think we would become, we would become permanent allies of science. And I think there is a lot of value in that. And some of the challenges that I foresee in integrating SciComm in STEM education right at graduate studies or undergraduate studies is the rigidity of the curriculum. And one way perhaps to get over this is to probably not to introduce this as a separate stream, but to integrate practical exercises, SciComm exercises in the core curriculum itself. That could probably be one way of solving this problem. And another challenge that I also, I mean, of course, there are lots of institutional challenges when it comes to, there might be time constraints, there might be also the different people that come into these STEM backgrounds obviously have different levels of communication expertise and different communication levels of different levels of communication skills. And therefore creating one curriculum that will fit all of these people might be a challenge. And that is and therefore integrating workshops that cater to smaller groups of people based on their knowledge level and communication levels might be very helpful. And yeah, I think I would perhaps stop here and yeah.
Thank you, Ponnari. I think you have pointed to some of the challenges, but I think those same challenges also can be turned into opportunities if you think about it in the way that Prajval had mentioned earlier, in terms of mindset change, in terms of mainstreaming communication as something that everybody needs to learn, and so on. But we can talk about that later. So the last speaker in this panel, is Dr. Aalok Khandekar. Aalok, may I ask you to, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it's been such a great discussion already. I'm not entirely sure I have too many new things to say at this point, but I'll just maybe make a few brief comments. So I come at this question of communication, both as something that I study and something that then I also practice. And I'll say a few brief things about that before maybe commenting on the possibilities of the desirability of integrating science communication in STEM. So I think in the initial prompt of like, how do we think about how would we emphasize the importance of public engagement for scientists? And I think many people have already invoked this idea of like the critique of the deficit model that we have been discussing here. But I think coming from where I do, like my understanding of communication is something that is integral to the process of science rather than something that comes after the science is done. So thinking about communication is something that is that helps shape not only what we tell people at the end of the process, but figuring out what questions should we ask in the first place. Right? And so thinking about what are our research agendas, what kinds of methods are appropriate at particular places, at particular contexts, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, thinking about communication as constitutive of doing science rather than something that that happens at the end. And that, in some ways, in one way of putting this is also like, I think communication then becomes how you do good science, right? And that is at least one reason and one way to emphasize the importance of public engagement in this context. But again, as many people here already emphasizing, both from within the institution as well as some of us who come at it from a different angle, it is still too often considered to be secondary, like something that happens after the fact, something that then doesn't, something that exists in hierarchical relationship with the science itself. Something that then doesn't get the same kind of institutional support and the same kind of institutional encouragement in the reward structures of science. Right? And so at least one important challenge institutionally to thinking about how might communication be integrated into the practice of science would be to think about, rethink the institutional framework within which science is done and science is practiced. Right? Which does itself then translate into how science is taught too. So very much in terms of education, in terms of our own careers, lot of emphasis on, for instance, publishing, on getting funded, and so on, but not necessarily the same kind of emphasis in terms of like what is gets called quote unquote outreach. The other kind of question that we have on the table here is around the question of education, integrating integrating science communication into STEM education. So I'll start with my own like example, and in terms of where I come from and where I am today. I started my undergraduate studies in engineering, continued with my master's studies in engineering before then pursuing a PhD in the social sciences in the field of science, technology, and society, broadly thinking critically, thinking about the social relationships of science and technology rather than being a technical person. Right? And I think one reason this happened, I think, and this is quite common for a lot of people in my field, but certainly for me in graduate studies was the first time that I even got to experience what education beyond engineering might look like. And so actually never even having been exposed to what social sciences and humanities might have to offer to this question, or why they might be important like me. So in my education, in my engineering education, I might have done like one course called communication skills, right, in which was about report writing, which was about like maybe doing presentations, but not much more. It wasn't until I got to the US that I got to experience what it means to do liberal education, what it looks like in practice, and what its advantages might be. Now, I am in some ways lucky and fortunate to now be in a setting and teaching in a setting which to some extent does follow that liberal model of education. Right? So students, undergraduate students in engineering and IT, for instance, do have a significant component of courses with the liberal arts department, maybe unlike many other universities and many other systems within the country. So there's certainly some space and some interesting things that might happen there. Not unsurprisingly, though, it doesn't necessarily lead to a very straightforward integration of what we might call communication into the STEM curricula. There are students who certainly get interested and excited by what somebody like me has to say, but there's also students who show up in the class and by and large there because they have to be there, right? So there is that is still something. Again, and unless the institutional culture around why we have this educational structure in the first place is more fully supported and is more widely shared, I think that kind of disconnect continues to be reified. The other space, which I actually find in some ways more exciting and more promising these days, there's a whole number of different master's courses, master's graduate level courses that seem to be coming up, including one in which I teach, which is a master's program in MTech program in climate change, right? But that gets taught by faculty from across campus, across departments, and the way the program itself is conceived. And I do think that there's a number of these kinds of programs coming up. But that teaching ends up being truly and really interdisciplinary, even if faculty, for instance, might stick to their own disciplinary silos in some ways. Students do go through a curriculum and go through classroom spaces where they do have to really deal with a whole broad spectrum of ideas and approaches and so on. Okay? And I supervise students who might have done a bachelor's in engineering, but now are interested in pursuing more policy relevant questions around climate and so on. Right? And so I think that is somewhere where you one of these spaces where you might see some interesting things happen. I think there's maybe for now I'll stop there.
Thank you, Aalok. I think we have quite a few different perspectives, even though, and experiences, obviously, because everybody has come to this from different starting points and their experiences, both with dealing with the public and dealing with people across disciplines has been quite different. So I'd like to just open it up now to the whole panel. And I have a couple of points that I'd like just to address to all of you, because in listening to the five of you speak, I realized that in some ways there are two broad models that are emerging of how we think about building communication capacity among people who practice science. And one is, like Prajval started us off thinking about communication as something that needs to be integrated in the way we do things generally. And I think that came through in, a couple of the different presentations as well. So it, not as an add-on, but, it needs to be the way we a responsiveness to audience, a responsiveness to publics, a responsiveness even to colleagues is what is at the heart of good communication. And if you have that, you don't need an add-on course. But at the same time, I think both Binoy and Ponnari talked about the need to think maybe more systematically about how we communicate. And that is a capability that we can or should add on to STEM courses. So I'm just wondering, the first approach that Prajval pointed to in some ways calls for a mindset change. And I think that is something that you did mention, and some of you mentioned in different ways. So when we're talking about a mindset change that is required to make better communicators of people, we're also talking about a mindset change that gets people to think more inclusively, more critically, more imaginatively about the way the public is. And that's a big ask. Whereas the second approach, which is, okay, we need to build communicative capacities in scientists. So let's do workshops, let's do courses. So how do you think, so the second approach is the more easily done approach, but whether it actually leads to better communicators is an open question. So I'm just wondering if you all have thoughts on those two. If one had to make a recommendation, how would you put your words behind both those approaches? So anyone from this group?
I can.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, carry on.
Maybe something I meant to say earlier also. I think, and so like I don't have a straightforward answer for you in terms of a recommendation of like this or that. Right? But I guess partly the question there is also like to what end? Like what is the purpose of like integrating communication or like making better communicators out of scientists, right? Because from my perspective, I mean, we do a little bit of it, and like Prajval was saying, like I mean, we also similarly have institutional kind of PR mechanisms which are like constantly on us to like give us material and we produce things and all of that kind of stuff. Right? And so I think two things. Like one of them is like I mean. I don't think we should discount the skill and the expertise that communicators have for themselves, right? I mean, so I don't think scientists need to take over that role as well, right? There are certainly instances and there's moments in which like that is important, and we need to be doing that communication and take up that kind of public role. But there might be instances. I think it's probably for me, it's better to think about this as a collaborative process of some kind, and not something that the scientist as an individual does, but something that is happening collectively, collaboratively, where different kinds of roles and responsibilities are carried out by different kinds of people. Right? At the level of like education and mindset change and like the former kind of approach, I think part of like that work is also just at least in part is about recognizing and sensitizing like students and so on to recognize that this is also important work, and this is also this takes skill, this takes like work and labor and so on, so as we don't tend to be dismissive of communication at the end of it because it seems just something that is easy to do, right? And so I think both of those things achieve different goals, and I think it's important to think about what those like what the purpose of pursuing that kind of integration is.
Yeah. Would any others like to add to that?
Yeah, can I add?
Yeah.
So earlier, around 2 years before, we conducted a workshop. The title was Scientist Communicate. Because, we generally say scientists need to communicate. And we try to understand what are the barriers like you people are discussing now. So one of the issue came out there, or if I can put that into one sentence, that is like once JRD Tata said, a system evolves in the way it is being evaluated. So a scientist is rarely evaluated for communication. Okay, so there you cannot exist that system to continue for a long period with them. And the other issues they raised was, one is red tape, because if I'm in a government institution, the number of barriers I have to cross before I give the information is very high. Many contexts, they will have to get permission from different people. And second thing, the hierarchy, because if somebody's information gets a lot of attention, obviously that will start to generate a lot of discussion in the institution. But at the same time, they were often scared about another thing, that is the mishap. If press do some mishap, so like I was hearing from one of the person said that they gave some title and press put it in a different way. Only one word was different or one spelling was different. The setback was very high that these people are not trained to handle that. And another thing, in another study, we searched whether they have the capability to handle the controversial questions. Like, if I'm a biologist, often I get the question, do you believe in God? Or what is your opinion about evolution? So if a controversial question comes, many of them said, for that I have data also with me. Other things are like the discussion results. They said that if you are a professional scientist, you are not going to continue with that. Because they will say that if it is on the social media, they will stop there. So if you want to bring the mindset change, obviously you have to discuss the reward, because all of us has limited amount of time only. And if you are you are taking a share of that time for communication, obviously you will have to compromise at some level. Otherwise, you should be at the top level of the institution, or institution should be giving you something like a science communication program. So in that scenario, even though the person has a mindset, like, the famous COMB model, which is used in behavior change, you need to have the capability, but you need to have the opportunity also. So mindset, you have to consider at this level. Second question. So there is a very famous argument, like those from the social science or war studies often quotes that if you want to protect your nation, either convert everybody into a soldier or generate who are better soldiers. So that's why people say that if the scientist communicator model has a lot of issue, you need to generate the communicators who are very efficient and who can work as a system which is working in like a coupled system with scientists, where they communicate with each other. And most importantly, now science communication, sorry if I'm taking more time, to let me know, I can stop there. The science communication is also becoming a very complex scenario. It's not just like putting the Facebook post or writing a blog, because next day that will be used as an evidence against you. And most importantly, if you go to the public, the question will be, it's not about the probability of the science. You will say that, yeah, 95% of the population will be having this. The question will be whether I will be affected by it or not. So it's also becoming a different system altogether, where you need specialists who can understand the mindset of the public, who can understand. Often, during most of the workshop which I conduct, I get a question: why should I read science if I am a banker, if I am a teacher, if I am something else? So we are giving a lot of emphasis that also we have to consider when we discuss. We are from this fraternity. That's why we are giving a lot of emphasis. But as person in the street, don't have to worry about all these things. And we are living on an information highway. We are competing with WhatsApp University. So we need to have more specialists who can understand the scientific ecosystem as well as the society and work as a bridging agent, who could work as a coupled system with scientists who may not have much time and whose target may not be communication.
Yeah, in fact, I think the second panel will address some of these issues because that's populated mostly by science communicators. There is one question in the chat, but before that, yeah, Prajval.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that, it's about Binoy's comment about, scientists may not have this as their main interest, and so we need somebody else to bridge the gap, etc. The fundamental point is that most science all over the world, and certainly here, is funded by the taxpayer. And so therefore, it is not appropriate for scientists to not feel that obligation. And secondly, science, any knowledge, not just scientific knowledge, but any knowledge is a public good. So those two things have to be kept in mind. And if the Department of Science and Technology is funding all these projects and whatnot, they do need to, put their money behind their words and change the way, what Binoy said exactly, change the way scientists are evaluated. And so scientists do need to be evaluated on research, teaching, and public engagement. That public engagement need not just be oratory. There are many ways in which practicing scientists can contribute to public engagement. And regional languages, this has come up in the chat. Regional languages, of course, are extremely important. I think all pedagogical insights are telling us that young people learn new concepts best in their own language. And so, that doesn't mean they should not be taught English, but English can be taught as a language, but doesn't have to be the means to learn science or to learn any kind of concepts. Concept learning can happen in the regional language. And the shocking thing is that I've seen in my experience, colleagues who are in fact native speakers of regional languages, when it comes to science communication, they feel inept at doing science communication in their native, even though they're native speakers of a regional language, which is very strange. I don't know what the reasons for that are, but I think it's really important to break these barriers. But fundamentally, it's not appropriate to say, oh, if scientists don't think that communication is not their forte, they can not do it. I don't think that's appropriate, because we have an obligation fundamentally. So hiring practices also have to change, and every applicant has to be asked to not just make a research statement, but also a teaching statement and a public engagement statement. And I would go further and say an equity statement, equality work statement, and a sustainability statement as to how they will contribute to the institution. And this is happening. I'm not just talking through my hat.
Yeah.
There are institutions across the world
that are demanding this.
Now do have these as their hiring practice.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, I mean, does it depend on the nature of the science? I mean, I completely agree that this inability to speak about not just what we call science, but any kind of specialized knowledge system in one's own native language. I think we've been alienated so much from conceptual vocabulary in those languages that we find it difficult then to communicate with people who don't speak English, even if we speak that language socially every day of our lives. And that's definitely a problem. But so I just wanted to understand whether you think the pathway to becoming good communicators is different if you work in a more theoretical field or in a more applied field, like Ponnari was talking about public health and the need to listen to the ground in order even to generate questions. So yeah, Ponnari, you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I had my hand up for your previous question, actually. So if
that's fine.
okay,
No, you can go ahead.
Yes, so I wanted to answer your question that while the former is what we should aspire to, the mindset change, I do think there is a lot of value in the latter as well, and in introducing these modules in graduate education. If you ask me, in my opinion, science communication is a scientific skill. I wouldn't even put it as a soft skill or something secondary to, scientific. I mean, I think it's part and parcel of scientific training, and it's important that students learn this along with all the other technical skills, instead of having to recalibrate their skills at a later point in time once they become academicians. And secondly, I think it's also academicians who are naturally good at communication, or who have developed this good communication skills, be it writing, be it, oral communication, be it social media. People who are good at communicating are the ones that will take up more SciComm and public engagement opportunities when it comes up. So, I mean, if you have two scientists, one who's a good communicator and the second one who's not so much, when you present an opportunity, it is obviously the former that would rise up to the occasion and do more public engagement. And so I think imbibing these skills in young students at a young age is very important. And I do see a lot of value in the latter, be it through workshops, or be it through integrated SciComm courses within the curriculum. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know why Sharath keeps disappearing from the group, but yes, Prajval, you had a response as well.
Terrible internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you mentioned that does it depend on the nature of the field and so on. So
Very
I couldn't
bits and pieces of what your very nice observations, I think. Yeah. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I couldn't resist because there was an occasion when I was explaining curvature of space-time and black holes and things like that to a bunch of high school students. And they turned around and said, why do we not learn about this in high school if that is the correct physics and not Newtonian physics? And that really set me thinking. And I'm right now in a university in Australia, and next to me is a physics department who have a program called Einstein First. And they have programs and activities designed for children starting with grade 3 or something, where they lead them on through hands-on activities to teach them about the curvature of space-time and how masses curve space-time. So I think the main barrier to scientists engaging in science communication, to be really honest, is if we think that our science, we are so brilliant and our science is so difficult that we cannot, communicate it, and we need not communicate it. Why should common people have to understand all this very difficult stuff that we are doing? Honestly, I have a feeling that that is the barrier. And that needs to change, because no science is so difficult. And I was also struck by the example that the experience that Ponnari narrated about reading these poems in the book. So I think that is kind of a hallmark of how biologists approach their practice. They are much less wedded to the idea that you need to be brilliant to do biology, and biology is, if not as difficult, if not more difficult, it's as difficult as physics. The kind of systems they're understanding are, very, very complex. But yet there is much less of an idea that you need to be brilliant in order to do biology. I think in physics, that is much more of an idea. So physics is, I think, a very good example of how these barriers get built up. So I think we need to sort of drop this idea that we're doing very difficult things. I think that will take us a long way.
Sharath, do you want to jump in on that? Yeah.
I just wanted to add, and I just hope I'm able to complete my sentences here, but I do agree with what Prajval is saying, but I just wanted to add to that there's also, as I remarked in my talk, there are sort of two kinds, there's a large amount of interest in physics for things like are very, that invoke, extra dimensions, or a black hole, cosmology and stuff like that. It's also in part informed by science fiction, Discovery Channel type of programs. I think it's more challenging for us, and I've tried this to talk about, say, very ordinary things. Like, for example, the sand pile problem, when you pour sand on and then it forms a...
Did we lose him mid-sentence? Prajval, do you know enough about the sand pile problem to talk about it?
No, I wanted to, the sand pile problem is an interesting problem. I mean, why does a sand pile form, right? Why does it assume certain shapes? It's like asking the question, how many atoms of silver do you need for it to actually look and behave like silver? Okay, Sharath has come back.
Talks about very, very mundane things and tries to put you into the discursive mode and make it sound interesting. I think there's a bigger challenge for us in trying to communicate in interesting ways and take the audience along in a process of inquiry, as rather than just information imparting. And it's much harder to do it with things that are very mundane. I think there's great physics and great ideas behind very ordinary looking things. So I think, the communication, at least in physical science, become a little more skewed towards these exotica. And I have a problem with that, as a communicator. It's kind of easier to hark back on good, videos, interesting. It's more difficult, I think, for example, why do ants form certain lines that they do when, there's a lot of very, very complex physics there. And I have a great time trying to sort of reason this out in non-technical leaves, in putting it across.
And, in fact, I think I was thinking we suffer from an excess of bad models when it comes to what we think of as science communication, right? So right at the start, Prajval talked about the brilliant scientist model, which I think all of you referred to in some ways, the whole gee whiz aspect of science that tends to get sold constantly. And I think now we're in a point in time where, with the attention economy and with the fire hose of information that we're constantly served, that for a scientist to develop a discursive mode of engagement becomes even more difficult. So whether you're talking about sort of semi-specialist audiences like those who are evaluating policy papers or those who are looking at grant documents, I think there is a little bit of that, what's the innovation here? And I think in framing innovation, everything in terms of innovation also puts a damper on people who may want to communicate science because they're thinking constantly in that gee whiz frame. So very quickly, I just wanted to ask each of you to weigh in on this idea of, okay, do you think this is something then that, if the mindset change is going to take us a long time, and what we need to do is, of course, offer these skills to students from an early age through the program, I think there is still a problem there because a skill is never learned unless there is a felt need. And I think people always get to that felt need only when, as all of you mentioned, evaluation becomes, values that skill. So in that scenario, how do we then introduce a skill that is either sidelined or not recognized or thought of as, oh, it's something everybody can do within a graduate program? I mean, talking about, the conscience, I mean, what Prajval said is, it is an imperative. We have a responsibility. I think those are very important things to acknowledge, but they're not internalized. Maybe it's a philosophical question, but if everybody can just very briefly address that before we break. Maybe we could go in the order in which anyone's ready. I see Binoy leaning forward, so maybe you could speak first.
Yeah. So one more element I want to add to the discussion before I move to the mind change quickly is, we talk a lot about science communication, but we don't apply the model of science to science communication often. We need to measure whatever we are saying, like it is bringing impact, it is bringing change. Most of the times what we do that, we assume that it is happening. So if you just check for the baseline data, how much impact a science communication program is creating at what level, we need to start measuring that. And we need to find the loopholes also where it is not bringing what are the factors which is blocking the target of the science communication. So along with all this discussion, like a scientist always they ask for the data, correct? But a science communicator, I never seen in any discussion asking for the data. You say that, yeah, it is like that. It may not be like that. When we started searching, we started some kind of experiments. We started getting that it is not the way we were expecting. So we need to make it more a data-driven thing. We need to measure the impact. Then we have to show that these are the lacunae existing, like a scientific problem. Define the lacunae, find and make a model to manage that lacunae, and try to implement that. And again, learn from the feedback and consider it as a system with multiple components interacting together. So then when it becomes more data driven, rigid, you can compete, you can even convince a policymaker or an educationist, anybody easily, first level. Second level is like, as you say, once it becomes so people working on behavior change often ask, what is the best model to bring the behavior change? They often say that if other person is getting benefit by doing something, others will passively try to follow that. So then we need to think about in that way how doing science communication, following science communication channels, learning to communicate becomes beneficial, and obviously that will become the part of the system passively itself.
Okay, so others, you have like about 45 seconds each to address the question.
I can go next.
Yes,
I think incentivizing is the only way that I see incentivizing, providing credits, recognitions, awards, for both the staff and also the students. Introducing credits for the students, I think, is the only way to go about this, in my opinion.
Thank you. Aalok?
Yeah, I think, like, I still want to fall back on the idea that it is just like emphasizing that it is essentially doing good science, and so not so much the moral, but rather a very practical one for practitioners themselves. The other thing I do potentially want to say here is, especially for students, I'm not sure that students also don't already recognize that to some extent, and are actually quite interested. I think the institutional structures in which then they progress in some ways incentivizes them, right? And so it's so some of it is I'm not even sure that we need to do the work of convincing so much as to intervening with them in the institutional spaces.
Creating a more enabling environment. Okay. Yes, maybe I'll go to Sharath next, because he is always in danger of dropping out.
Say, that I found it very useful. In fact, I actually think that the argumentative mode in teaching is so important, in the sense that we largely tend to just, deliver a lot of facts and relationships between these quantities and stuff like that. But I think it's really important, especially at the earliest stages, and I'm here talking about teaching, not just the one-off lecture that I gave somewhere else. And in teaching, it's very important not to teach them a whole lot of things, but to bank on just a few ideas and help them along, develop that. And in the process, realize what are the things, what are the accoutrements that they would need to get along the way. And, so that serves often as a motivation, when, let me try and bring you an example here. When I teach sometimes students about the ways in which we record colors and spectra and so on. And I go through a process that makes them realize that the spectrum is nothing but mapping a time, something that's happening in time, into a space that records a frequency versus the intensity of something. So that's called a Fourier transform. And then I make them realize that the language of Fourier analysis is what they would need to pick up in order to understand how this mapping is carried out. So rather than, isolate teaching them Fourier transforms and so on with the physical process. So somewhere sort of integrating it all and then making them go through a process that makes them actually realize that there are some things that, need to be garnered along the way, is the way I found, useful in imparting skills. So in other words, just to say very shortly, the skills that you need for the main body of whatever you're trying to communicate should be somehow woven into the main body itself and should not come as isolated, compartmentalized little subjects, subheadings.
Yeah. So basically having a model, a pedagogic model that imparts the skill within it. Okay,
Yes.
we're like almost entirely we are actually out of time, but I will let Prajval have the last word if you have anything to add.
I just wanted to say, I agree with Sharath that it should be integrated, not as an add-on. And I think that if, I mean, just using this dictum that if you want to understand something deeper, you teach it. I mean, this is something that, you know, any teacher would say automatically. The same thing applies to what we are talking about, I think. So, you know, there could be exercises or there could be things that students need to do as part of every course where they need to learn how to explain whatever they've learned to somebody else in a sort of a interactive way where they're open to being questioned. And that is really the key, right? That we should be open to being questioned. That is really the key. And so I don't think it's that hard. And in terms of incentives, I think if scientists engage in this activity, now I'm talking about the scientists, not so much about the curriculum, but if the scientists engage in this activity, it does deepen our understanding. And I don't think we need anything more as an incentive other than that.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I mean, I can already see, you know, how I might put the conversation into certain, into a certain way of thinking about building curricula or not. But thank you all so much for participating in this discussion. And we do have a short break after which we will speak with the science communicators. It would be great if you all could stay on for that and engage with them as well. And you can, of course, turn your videos off and go get your coffee or tea or whatever at this point. And we will be back at 5:40 and start the second panel. So that means it gives me 7 minutes.
Just now at the end of,
yeah,
Usha, just now at the end of all of my internet's behaving perfectly fine.
So you should then stay for the second half. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all. We can all get up
because the internet has been kind enough to accommodate me. Yeah.
I would encourage you to get up, stretch, drink some water, and come back. Thank you. So welcome back, everyone. Shrestha, any opening remarks, or should we just get into the panel?
Let me introduce the panel, then we can.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. That was a very engaging and important conversation. And our second panel consists of experienced science communicators. And before Professor Raman takes over, I'd like to briefly introduce our brilliant panelists. I'll share the short bios in the chat. First up, we have Dr. Janvi Phalke, who's a historian of science and technology and the founding director of Science Gallery, Bengaluru. Then we have Dr. Somnatha Karak, who is a science communicator and leads science communication and public outreach at Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology, Hyderabad. Next, we have Teja Balanthrapu. He's the Associate Director of Science, Health Data and Storytelling at LV Prasad Eye Institute, Hyderabad. Next, we have Dr. Sara Iqbal, who's a science engagement consultant currently working with Foundation for Advancing Science and Technology, or FAST India. Next, we have Dr. Shuli Mitra, who is a science communicator and a consultant at CMC Vellore Archives. We were supposed to have Sayantan Datta, but they are facing a situation due to floods near the coast of Andhra Pradesh. We hope they try to join us soon, but let's get started with the panel. Over to Professor Raman.
Thank you, Shrestha. Yeah, I mean, we know Shantan is safe, but because of the breakdown of communications, they may not be able to join us. but possibly they'll turn up at some point. So if Shantan does, it'll be great. So thanks all of you for joining us. And, I realize that, all of us have Zoom fatigue, and for you to have stayed through the first panel and still be here, really grateful. So I will not frame this panel except to say that in some ways we have on this panel people who are doing science communication in various ways. And not all of you have a background in science, except, perhaps Somdata, who has a PhD in neuroscience, but the others have come to science communication in different ways. So we'll go ahead and get started with Janvi. So if I can ask you to join me on the panel and open up your, yes, thank you. So, so all of you had the framing questions that I asked, so I will not repeat them here. I think they'll come through in the way you speak about this, but if you'd like to also respond to some of the things that came up in the first panel, that would be fine as well. So over to you, Jan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Usha. So let me start by saying that I'm not a science communicator. So I think, and I don't self-identify as one, because it would be unfair to do so. I have never done science communication, and what I do now is also not science communication. I am a historian of science by training. I don't, of course, do history of science anymore. I do public engagement. And also, I think there are some things that came up in the earlier discussion, and I'm sure others will come up now, which is that it's an Anglo-American approach to say that science is the natural sciences alone. If you go to the European continent, science includes the human and social sciences as well. So in that sense, one needs to be aware of the breadth of, so any rigorous knowledge production can be looked at, with some amount of generosity, a generosity that I think we singularly lack in the Indian context, which has consequences. We produce bad historians and we produce bad scientists. Of course, at the level of generality, there are exceptions everywhere, and they do a brilliant job any which way. So let me make a set of observations. The first one is that I don't think there is any such thing as a lay audience for anybody. We all possess knowledge of some kind or the other. It might not be the self-same knowledge as the one that in a particular set of circumstances is to be shared or exchanged or even communicated. We all come with something we know. And I think the dignity for that knowledge and knowing is lost. It's something that Prajval mentioned earlier, that knowledge is a common good, a public good, and that recognition in our society is particularly lacking, because for millennia we have believed that knowledge is not a common good and that it belongs only to a certain section of society who is allowed to have cultural authority over knowledge. And it is precisely that, I think, historical context that allows us to believe that knowledge is to be shared by a particular section of society with others, and that is, I think, that's a misgiving. I don't think that has any, as Prajval very rightly said, foundation in actual society or in knowledge producing communities. The one place where I do differ with Prajval is that I think scientists, across the human, social, and natural sciences, do science, and I think they should be allowed to do science and not sort of have the ability or the desire to necessarily communicate it. Those who can and are able to do should do. There should be structures. We should produce structures, and we should produce in the system people who are capable of making public engagement and science communication possible out of an interest and out of a commitment to make knowledge a public good. Because not all of us can communicate, not all of us are able to communicate. And I think, I completely share with Prajval the commitment to the taxpayer and the obligation to the taxpayer, or to, which of course also has its flip side, because when funders other than the taxpayer come into question, then how does one communicate and how does one seek an approval or a justification for the work that one has done? And so there is an obligation to put knowledge into the public domain. Who does it and how we do it can be structured in ways other than the scientists taking on the responsibility to communicate. That doesn't mean they shouldn't. That doesn't mean they cannot. It just means that those who can should do, those who are able to should do, and those who cannot should find other ways to do so. Science communication is not relevant for STEM alone, because I think knowledge belongs in the public domain for reasons other than people wanting to become scientists or appreciating the wonderful nature of science or rigor of scientific knowledge. We are living in a time when we face climate change, pandemics, CRISPR-Cas, artificial intelligence as something that pervade everyday life. These are knowledge and products of knowledge, although not necessarily produced in a linear fashion, which have the capacity for irreversibly organizing or reorganizing our social and personal lives. At this point, when we are taking decisions on what kind of treatments we should get or what kinds of information we should share with various devices, and what kind of lifestyles we should lead, at that point of time, having access to and having the ability to discern the quality of knowledge that we are being shared with is a responsibility that we need, is a responsibility and an access we need to have in order to simply exercise the right of being an active citizen. So science, like many things human beings do, is a social enterprise. So what the responsibility that people who either communicate science or create public engagement formats like myself have is the responsibility to share an insight into how knowledge is produced. It's not necessarily only sharing the outcomes of that process of knowledge production, because when we do so, we retain then a certain lack of transparency around how and why knowledge is produced, as opposed to just, sharing outcomes of knowledge and then saying, here's what we have actually understood. No, why are we wanting to understand this? Why is this important? I would not even say equally, are more important than sharing the outcomes of research. Engagement is a two-way street, and that two-way street in certain fields is probably happening more than in other fields. And how does one open doors to produce not an exchange, as Sharath said, of facts, but actually of a perspective on why knowledge matters and what and allow every citizen to have the dignity to dwell on and contribute to understanding what is our collective relationship to fundamental knowledge. And that is something, because it's not simply, this relationship is important to understand, not only to be able to continue funding fundamental knowledge, but in order to understand what kinds of knowledge we need if we want to lead different lives, if we want a different understanding of good society, good politics, and good futures. I think what we need in many ways is to dismantle, and this has already been said by speakers before me, dismantle the cultural authority of science and the class that holds it. I think what we need to do is to put in place professionals who are able to talk not science, but about science. The art world has understood this. We have a profession of art critics. We do not encourage science journalism or a critical evaluation of science in the public domain. Instead, what we say is, here's what they need to know, us and them. So coming back to my first point, there is no such thing as a lay audience, and therefore there shouldn't be a group of people deciding what is to be communicated to people, and definitely not after the fact of the knowledge being produced, but before and during its production, in order for them to be able to have a say. Collectively, as a society, do we need an insight into this? Collectively, as a society, do we need things like this? And I think it's important to see our work not as a service that is provided to either side, but as a critical engagement that is an intellectual responsibility that everyone is capable of having, provided we have created structures that allow people an insight and an access to how knowledge is produced, why knowledge is produced, what knowledge is produced. So with that, I will stop and allow the next person to come in. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janvi. I think, and I apologies for calling you a science communicator. I do know you're a historian of science, but I think it's the public engagement role that really we were interested in hearing from. And I think in some ways you've forced us to think more radically about how we talk about science and what is science even, right? And who's doing the talking and to whom and so on. So with that, I'd like to call in Somdatta, who is in much more, I guess, of a traditional science communication role. But I think she shares many of these concerns. So Somdatta, are you here?
Yes. Hi.
Yes,
thanks, Usha and Shrishta, for inviting me to this session. And yes, I will be talking largely as a practicing science communicator, and maybe the next few minutes that I speak, it will be more about how I go about engaging PhD students at CCMB, a research institute where I work, in the science communication efforts that happen at the institute. Now, why we engage our PhD students in this, I have at least two reasons for this. One is, though I agree with Prajval's comment that science communicators and institutes should be the critiques to the scientists, but my own experience is that after a certain point, the scientists are very rigid. I mean, they're not open to suggestions on how science communication should be done. And the second is, at CCMB, we also have science communication as a course mandate for the PhD students. So this includes both a theoretical understanding, a brief theoretical understanding, and a practical engagement into the activities. So most of CCMB's outreach activities or science communication activities are geared towards young people, because, I mean, said unsaid is that we are a research institute, we need PhD students to work with us. We want young people to know about science and technological developments that happen, so that some of them will come and work with us at some point. So having said that, when CCMB's PhD students have engaged in different ways, but they, I mean, since I have worked with CCMB in the last 6 years, it started with them participating in some of the mentoring programs for undergraduate as well as school students. Some of these have run for months, especially for college students, and some for weeks for school students. And during these engagements, we constantly saw something that is not surprising to anyone at all, that science, the language of science, is not accessible to most people. And it's probably the urban privileged who have any sort of access to even understanding it. I'm not even saying access to information. I'm saying that even if you give the information, to just understand what it is really talking about. So we definitely saw that inaccessibility is there. And here I'm talking, I mean, research papers are written in a way, I mean, on one hand, we expect our undergraduate students to access research papers, but then the research papers are not written in a way that an average undergraduate in India will understand them. So that was one of our key observations. The same holds true for school students, obviously. And that is when we saw that CCMB students, on the other hand, because they come from diverse backgrounds, diverse places in India, I mean, and because they are younger, which means that they're not yet fully inducted into the ivory towers of academia, that they are much better able to find connects that relate with the student population in colleges as well as in schools. This was also, and given that I said that the way science information is presented is not understandable to most of the young people in India, that is why we also started SciTales, which is a popular science website by CCMB. And the reason I'm bringing SciTales in this conversation is this, that this website has allowed our students to talk about their science in a way that they want, which means that they have the liberty to talk about the process of what they study, how they study. And it also compels them to go beyond the narrow questions that they're addressing in their thesis. And that happens because I oversee what they are doing. So that push probably comes more from me, that I identify what is that big area that they should be talking about and they can talk about given their understanding and expertise in a certain field. And maybe the biggest advantage that the students have identified is that their peers who are not in science or their families understand what they are working on. But the other advantages that I see as an institutional science communicator is that this now finds readership among other students, other teachers. The press takes note of what our scientists say, and then they adapt it for their readership. So in a way, I mean, when we think about why should scientists do science communication, at least in the younger population, I see that they find joy in just explaining what they work on to their own families, because the problem really, I mean, for them, the problem is as basic as their own near and dear ones don't understand what they're spending time on. And from there, the institute benefits in rather intangible ways, where we are creating content that finds readership in different kinds of people. And we hope that this gives them an insight and avenue into developing something of their own in their own capacity, however they wish to. And that, I mean, I probably will end on that, because all said and done, I mean, SciTales is still an English website. So I'm not at all claiming that we are anywhere near solving any of the problems that we ourselves have seen. It's just about inspiring young people to show that, okay, these things can be done, and probably giving them some of the tools and understanding of how they can go about doing them. So with that, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Somdatta. I think, some of the things you said in terms of creating both the structures and the tools that enable people to engage, with audiences, with other stakeholders in this system that we call science loosely, right? Or knowledge production. So thanks for that. And we'll come back to some of the points you made, and also, some of the provocations that Janvi raised earlier when we're in the discussion slot. But I'd like to now move on to Teja, who is, in some ways, maybe he comes to science through communication. So yes, Teja.
Thank you so much for that and introduction. And I must say, it's the sign of a good panel, I guess, is that I already have half of my notes are redundant. Jahnavi and Somdatta have sort of covered the ideas and the outreach, and so I have very little to sort of add at this point, but let me soldier on. One of the things that, so I work in an eye hospital, and I come from a communications degree. I don't have a science degree. And so one of the things that I have had to do is to help sort of set a frame for what, so, and we don't even call it science communications formally within the organization. And so I sort of had to set a frame to what it means, that, what does this kind of outreach mean? So I'll try and sort of run through it, and then I will try and address some of the questions that sort of were the frame for this session. The way we sort of articulated what science communication is in this context is that an opportunity to instill, create, or share an interest and an appreciation of science and health in our, and health in our context. It is also, basically a process and a product of knowledge building. I can sort of unpack what I sort of mean by that a little later. We also sort of define it as a tool to sort of widen the audience for scientific ideas, and especially for health and healthcare in our context. The bit that I try to add is that, it is also an art form where it enables creative expression and individual style, and it gives a frame and space for that, because sometimes the delivery of science can become a job, a responsibility even, and and to be able to help the scientists and the clinicians that I work with to find some space where it is also pleasure and a scope and a space for contemplation, to sort of fall back on the three Aristotelian ways of life. So that is also something that
I have been interested in exploring. And also this whole idea, sort of coming off that, this whole idea of, interacting with all the human senses and all the human potential, our dreams, aspirations, prejudices, and everything. And so ultimately, it's sort of, it is the mode of communication. I mean, the science communication as a project is basically a medium of wonder and curiosity, right? And that is a very broad and hard thing to sort of keep going, that small spark or that small flame going, both for practicing scientists and clinicians, and also the audiences that we sort of reach out and go with, right? So that's the broad frame that I have sort of listed. And so I sort of look at the questions, where you were saying, what sort of training, is essential for scientists and science students. And my take is basically what Janhavi and the others were saying, that it has to be a mixed group, right? Though, and I understand, because I come from a background where, the short-term gains are diffuse in a mixed group, whereas the long-term ones are much more concrete, right? And so it's harder to sell in the short term the benefits of having a mixed group. Whereas, one of the advantages I've realized, for example, is that there are networks of support, right? So once you go down a career path, it can be fairly narrow. It can be fairly, the window of what is possible starts narrowing as you progress down your career. And having the last college or the last opportunity to meet a diverse group is where you sort of end up going back to have those conversations about what else is to sort of rekindle the spark of curiosity, of interest, etc. So there is that. So these are diffuse gains which are very hard to sort of articulate immediately during when the course or the training program is over. But these are really concrete and useful ones. To sort of look at the more, and this is the bit where where I really was shaking, nodding vigorously when Janhavi was talking about this idea of social responsibility and what that means for science practitioners, be it scientists or science communicators, is that there are many practices, especially in health, that have benefited from task shifting, from finding people, finding collaborators who, not everybody can do everything, and finding means of contributing to the process of outreach, to the process of even without the burden of communication, right? Just to, even you sit and you paint something and you're part of an art workshop with a bunch of scientists and mixed groups again, is a very cathartic experience I have found in the workshops that we've run at my organization. Right, so so this idea of so, and that the public outrage, the public engagement may not be everybody's cup of tea, but everybody will be able to find a role where they can contribute to the process, and the program ideally should enable that kind of space, and which basically means that there is, I think, a need for professional I would say that, wouldn't I? for science communicators who will take on and this is where some of the more complex bit is, so things like product, right? So when we are so the science communication is not happening in a vacuum. There is a whole bunch of there is a big market. There are large audiences, and when people start, and large lay audiences, again, something that Janhavi said, which again I was nodding vigorously, is that when the pin is set on a large lay audience, it is you end up ignoring a whole bunch of smaller segments which may be more receptive, or which may be more interested in engaging in a conversation and not just be a recipient of public health information or tips or tricks and things like that, and which also sort of brings us into things like into mixed messages and what that means, right? So to give you an example, Diwali was a couple of weeks ago. We put out a big, just before Diwali. Diwali is a time when a whole bunch of ocular burns come to the institute, the hospital. People play with firecrackers, there are accidents, and then they come in. So we put out some, a material before Diwali warning people about this. And we saw an increase in the number of patients who came. right? And so the conversation that I was having with the doctors is that, so the mixed message there is, so they were worried that, was it a failure of communication? But then what I was trying to tell them is, it is also possible that they realize that if something goes wrong, MB Prasad Institute is there, right? So these are, how do you sort of parse your outreach in terms of outcomes? How do you measure? These are all complex things, and the world is where you have analytics and companies that offer analytic tools. It is not something that you take light. It's very expensive. It is not something that you take lightly, and it is a job, right? It requires our understanding of, and even to make the decision to not indulge in analytics and privacy invasive technologies itself requires some thought and some understanding of what is happening. And so, so that is for me a good example of why it is important to bring in professionals, or at least collaborators whose job it is to sort of worry about all this and to figure out what it is. And so it is not just simply a question of scientists or science students stepping out into the world and spreading what they have. They have to engage with a really complicated world where there are, in fact, there are people who are willing to support and with the values that you bring to your work. Those are complicated questions, and there are no straightforward, easy answers. And so those require people, those require groups within an organization to engage with and discuss. So that's just with the product, and but there is also more, like understanding what a press release is not outreach, right, to media. So most scientists would agree with that, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, it would devolve down to a press release, right? So then, what other means of? So how do you understand media, and how do you sort of plan your your collaboration with your audiences, but in a way that works, right? How do you sort of work with the media to ensure? So these are all, and is it writing, is it video, is it social? So these are all fabulous time sinks, right? You can spend hours and not have much to show for all that effort and all the money that goes into all this, right? Unless you sort of are thinking about what are the things that you are looking for. So I don't want to make it sound like it's a very big and complicated enterprise, but I just want to say that it is complex, and it requires engagement, and it requires a lot of thinking and planning before you jump in. And so their task shifting becomes very important, which I'm sort of, it also connects back to this idea of having these mixed groups, because then it helps to understand what else is happening and what else is possible, and who are the other collaborators that you can connect up with and do what you want to do, right? Again, so in that sense, even so, what another good example, I mean, like the Diwali thing, is misinformation, which is a very hard. Is it a signal or is it a symptom? Is something that is very hard for most of us to sort of, so do we, when somebody it sort of boils down to what Janhavi was saying about what do people bring, right? Are they passive recipients, or are you sort of working with them? And I think even Sharath was saying this in the previous panel about, how do you, so it is not target, there is a space and there is a need to target misinformation. I'm not trying to, but is that, but I'm trying to sort of, where do you put the weights in that, right? So unless you have that relationship, unless there is that collaboration, unless there is a sense of how science happens, right? Instead of just looking at the results or, vaccines, this, when somebody puts things up about specificity and, sensitivity, that is too late. That is too late, right? For people to understand why those two values are important, or how to use them in understanding the decision, should you jab your 11-year-old with a vaccine, right? Is that like a good thing to do or not? These are fears that people have. To dismiss them or to then throw a whole bunch of information may not be. So unless there is unless there's an ongoing dialogue and there's an ongoing relationship between the scientific institutions in a city, and this is something that Somdata and I are really very keen in pursuing, which is, what are these long collaborative relationships that exist within a city or a space or an urban space? And how do you build those relationships where the process of science is something that we all share in, and not just the fruits or not just the ultimate results? Yes. So, and finally, I think this is something that one of the questions was about translations. And this is something that I also struggle with, because there are so many languages, and the urge and this is again something which is why, working with translators of different types helps, because there is this urge to develop neologisms in, say, Telugu or Tamil, or basically come up with Sanskritized words which nobody knows. I mean, you only sort of get it from the context, right? So nobody comes up with words for computer, say, right? But a whole bunch of scientific terms, you come up with Sanskritized terms and other neologisms that people may not connect with, and it may just mean that the decision that I end up taking is I just use the English word, right? So, but how do you then? So, but those are decisions again that come with translations, and how do you sort of bring in? How do you ensure that the context is good enough for scientists, or sorry, for the readers to understand what it is that you're doing when you translate something that is produced in English, that is the original, the material is also in English, the science communication ideas are also in English, and then they are translated into another language. And so then how does it work, and how do you ensure that it works, especially in a context where words don't exist, or words, or even if they do exist, a very, very tight and a very narrow band of your readers will know what those words mean. And so then does it just make sense to use English terms there? So those are all decisions again. Anyway, so I will stop here.
Thank you, Teja. You started with the very philosophical and ended with the very pragmatic. So that's a big sweep. Again, lots to think about. So we'll go straight on to Sarah, who is with Fast India. And yeah, thank you.
So thanks a lot. And I almost forgot that I'm also supposed to speak. I'm enjoying this discussion so much. And thank you so much, Usha and Shrestha, for inviting me to this. And I think as someone in the space of public engagement and science communication, I think these discussions are very rare. I think a lot of us practitioners don't find this space where we can discuss and think about public engagement and science communication. So I think this is a very useful, fora for us. And also why we started something called SciComm Think Labs, which Usha, you're also, you've been helping us with. So, as everything important has already been said, really fantastic context for, why we're all here has already been set. Of knowledge being a public good, of the accountability to the taxpayer, the existing, hegemonic structures of knowledge production and exchange and communication, and also who participates in this communication and engagement process. And I think these are all very, very important questions for us to really think about very deeply, especially as practitioners. And I guess I'll probably focus more on, my journey in the science, rather in the training capacity building space in science communication and engagement. And not so much in the practice. And there are two major, I would say, encounters or experiences during my scientific training, during my PhD and postdoc, that really kind of, made me think about the science and society interface more deeply. And I think one was just how badly, how poorly scientists communicate even within the community, and that also, when I was doing a PhD, that led us to start a magazine to just share and disseminate the work that we were doing in the department, so it was a very basic need, a gap that we identified. And that's really where my sort of interest in communication and the need to kind of exchange ideas and knowledge really began. And then during my postdoc, I was doing my postdoc at a private research institution in the US, which was majorly funded by philanthropy. And we were constantly meeting philanthropists and private donors, and we're trying to tell them why our research is important, why they should fund us. And I think that encounter really made me realize how important I think society contribution to science is, and also how it influences science, and what we do in scientific research, and how the research agenda is influenced by society and the public at large in various ways. And I think these were some of the experiences that kind of led me to, obviously, the field of public engagement when I moved back to India more than 8 years ago and pivoted my career from research to public engagement. I joined the science funding agency DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance as their first public engagement officer, and realized soon enough that not only did I not have any peers at that point, there was barely any infrastructure at institutions or science departments to support communication of science by researchers or scientists that I had witnessed in back in the US. But as any funder would like, they would like to make their funded research more visible, more accessible, and more impactful. We set out to develop interventions and programs to enable our grantees to communicate their work to diverse set of audiences, and also to be able to engage more effectively with communities or publics that they were working with. And I must tell you here that if a funder tells its grantees that you must do something, they will do it. So I think I would say in my experience of over 7 years of working at the funding agency, I really saw I saw that the mindset, behavior change, and the culture change was very rapid, because there was a funding agency that was not only asking for very high quality research, but it was also asking its grantees to make its research more accessible and engaging. And I think that definitely, I feel, made the researchers think about public engagement a little more deeply. But I would also agree that there is a whole spectrum of researchers and scientists, from those who are interested, those who are indifferent, those who are interested but are not equipped. And so I think the training has to cover somehow all of these, everyone on that spectrum to some extent. If we are to kind of fulfill the obligation to the taxpayer, and also to make research more or the showcase of research more inclusive, because sometimes you see certain scientists or researchers work getting more kind of exposure just because they are better at communicating it, whereas there are many who are doing great research but they just don't have the tools or the skills to communicate. So we need to really kind of tackle this sort of inequality, or inequity there. At India Alliance, the funding agency, we realized that we needed better grant applications. So we started scientific communication workshops. But when they hired me, I obviously included an element of science communication and public communication of science. So we slowly kind of morphed into science communication workshops, which were targeted at PhD students and postdocs and also early career researchers. And I realized during this time when we were delivering these workshops that not only as scientists, or at least I would say at that time, I'm talking about almost 7 years ago, were not only clueless about how to go about communicating their science, many of them were also indifferent. They just didn't see the need or the point of doing it. And of course, many felt they were just not equipped, or they were not supported, or they were not enabled. And I have to say, this has kind of changed over the years. I've definitely seen a huge shift, in the last couple of years, in how a lot more scientists, a lot more science communicators are, coming up and doing great work. And I think while these science communication workshops, this funding agency was, organizing in different parts of the country, in different institutions, where we were just kind of sowing a seed or sensitizing them in science communication and public engagement, there was really no institutional mechanism to sustain this interest and the skill. So we felt that while we are parachuting in and out of these institutions, we are not really leaving behind any legacy or anything that would continue this thing. So then when I moved out of India Alliance, I think I started thinking a lot about institutional science communication, building capacity for institutional science communication, because I realized that even for scientists, or for scientists and researchers to communicate science, they need to have that infrastructure, that support within the institution to be able to do that. And so really shifting from individual capacity building to more institutional capacity building, and I realized that that's where the role of science communicator or a public engagement practitioner within an institution becomes very important, to kind of hold these sort of interventions and programs, and also doing them well, and doing them in an evidence-based manner, and so that it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem tokenistic. And in this process of also realize that a lot of our training in science communication, or a lot of our practice in science communication, is very one way. I mean, we barely talk about engagement, dialogue with the public, or with non-science people or people from other disciplines. And I think I've also noticed that as scientists, we want to talk and not listen. So I think that's also like a big gap, and I think that's has to be part of the training, is how do we listen and how do we try to find out who we are communicating with and why are we communicating with them. So I guess some of these things have already been covered by previous speakers, so I won't get into that. So since then, we've been working at Fast India. We've been working on developing resources for institutions to be able to develop these mechanisms and infrastructure at their institution. We have also been mentoring some of the institutions to develop these capacities. But I think this has to be done on a much larger scale, more systematically, with a lot more funding, with a lot more serious commitment coming from institutions, and not to see this as just, that we need to build PR capacity for science in these institutions, but we really need to move beyond that if we want to meaningfully engage with the non-science public. And so one of the initiatives we've also launched while I was at FAST was we developed these science communication courses for the Capacity Building Commission, which has been mandated by the government to develop capacity building programs for bureaucrats as well as various departments and research labs in the country. Janvi has also developed a history of science course for the same platform, which is called iGot. And we're hoping that through this, perhaps through these more government-led initiatives, we're able to institutionalize science communication. Perhaps we are able to influence science, how science communication is thought about, or how it's done in the country. Because I think a lot of the science communication efforts before I joined or came back to India, I felt were really dominated by the government and what the government wanted out of them, and there was very little room for others to really contribute and participate in science communication and public engagement. So I think we have to kind of create this space, and I think the training that we think about, it could, and I do think the training is important. I think a lot of us here, I think in this panel, who are doing science communication and public engagement are doing it, have learned on the job. And I think there have been moments where I have received structured training or some sort of I've attended a course where it has really helped me structure my thoughts, have some frameworks to rely upon, use, evaluation to look at whether my science communication and engagement efforts are working or not. And so really kind of do what we're doing more thoughtfully and more, I think, systematically, so that we're able to make a better case for what we're doing. And so I think the training needs to create space for thinking beyond what we are doing right now. And so I think we have to think beyond the status quo. And there is science communication training going on. There is the science communication as a space, or public engagement as a space, is really diverse, really large. And I think Teja also, alluded to that. So I think we have to think of all of those things while we develop, the kind of training or capacity building programs. And I'm going to stop rambling and maybe, back to you, Usha.
Thank you, Sarah. In fact, it makes me wonder, so what are we doing here? There's a model that we can just take and adopt. But thank you for that. And I also realized that, I've been in one way or another doing writing about science and science communication for like 35 years, and I never had a community. So it is really great to see that there is this community. So, okay, so thanks, Sarah. And we'll move on to the last speaker, since I don't think Shantan has come. So Shirley, can I ask you to speak?
Yes, thanks, Usha. And following up this exemplary lineup of speakers, there is absolutely nothing for me to say. So I expected this, and so what I did was, Sarah pointed out this thing. Most of the science communicators in the community, in the small community that we have learned what we do on the job. And what I've done is thought a little bit about what should be the elements of a good science communication course in India. Of course, I have also been speaking with others in the community and you as well. And so I have been through my work with doctors, physicians, scientists, and some science advisors. I have been a fly on the wall during different, very important incidents, and that gave me an opportunity to just sit back and observe what is going on and take home some lessons for me as a communicator. So the first situation that I'm going to share about is something that happened a couple of months back. I was invited to attend this communication course that was meant for MBBS interns. And effective communication is a very crucial aspect of doctor's role, and especially when it comes to breaking difficult news, talking about very complex terms, and just listening to patients before they start talking. So I'm going to talk about various lessons that I learned. So the first one was empathy and compassion in the way the doctors approach difficult conversations with empathy, and understand that patients may be experiencing fear or anxiety or sadness. One's ability to empathize can greatly impact the experience of communication, and then also a patient's experience of getting difficult news, maybe. The second thing was doctors very actively listen to patients and understand their concerns, their fears and questions before, and while also ensuring that the patient is feeling heard and understood before they start talking. And when they do start talking, they use very clear and simple language while conveying information, while discussing medical conditions or treatment plans. And they're very careful about avoiding jargon and technical terms that usually confuse patients. One other thing that they do, and we as science communicators don't do it very often, is setting the right environment. They choose appropriate setting for difficult conversations, for having difficult conversations. They ensure that the patient has adequate privacy while talking about what they are talking, and they ensure that there are minimal interruptions. The other thing is also maintaining cultural sensitivity. One is a doctor makes sure that they're aware of the cultural differences and that they respect that. And different cultures usually have different expectations regarding disclosure of information, decision-making processes, expression of emotions, etc. And so being sensitive to that difference is what hugely impacts the way a doctor talks to a patient. The next thing was is about honesty and transparency. While telling a patient that they might be having a very debilitating condition or maybe a terminal condition, they have to be honest and transparent. Patients sooner or later will appreciate the openness and honesty, even if the information is very challenging. The other thing that we could learn from doctors is following up, offering ongoing support, offering continuing support, and following up after having delivered an information, a useful information. Usually patients need some time to process difficult information. The same might happen with people getting to know about a new vaccine and the fact that they need it and need it now. The second situation that the second incident that I want to talk about is about around the evolution of discussions around controlled human infection model studies. So this year, ICMR's bioethics unit released a statement on conducting these studies in India. And I was a part of a very old meeting which took place in 2018. And before that, for everyone, CHIM studies are essentially involve introducing an infectious agent into a body of a healthy volunteer in very controlled conditions. And these are usually done to study the efficacy of a vaccine, or the progression of a disease in a live human being. And the strongest reason that why CHIM studies are advocated by the scientists is that they can speed up vaccine research. So the Department of Biotechnology, along with a Faridabad-based research institute, started pushing for policy changes to introduce these studies in India. And the first few studies were supposed to be with about cholera. The organizations had consultations with various stakeholders, and that included researchers, lawyers, the media, ethicists, to understand the regulatory needs of having such studies and to understand the potential issues that might crop up later. So, according to one of the experts in ethics, the general public is expected to be apprehensive about CHIM studies, and for reasons that all of us know and understand. And the reasons could be unfamiliarity with a certain kind of study, and a perception that poor Indians might be used as guinea pigs. So it was clear that various technical, ethical, clinical issues need to be resolved before India joins that group of countries that can anchor CHIM studies. So the biggest challenge, it was acknowledged, was going to be public perception. So what they did was they engaged with media and ethicists from the very beginning. So there were different people, who had a say on the table. The public wasn't there, of course, but media, being their representatives, were there right since the beginning. As a practitioner in science communication, my lesson was that having all stakeholders on board should not be a sequential process. It can be parallel, and this has also been reported by the same group which was a part of the beginning processes of CHIM studies. They published the study about public perception of CHIM studies this year, and acknowledging that continuous communication is going to be very important when it comes to something as complex as CHIM studies. And so is managing perception of everyone involved to make sure that, the process goes on and takes its due course. I also understood that, it would be important to use very inclusive language, as we will have patient advocates also sharing the table, and we will need to listen and not just, keep giving information. And the lessons that I learned over there have been very helpful for me when I am asked to be responsible for formulating communication strategies, which is going to impact the public. Through both these, by narrating both these situations, I'm essentially trying to make the case that and effectively agreeing with everyone who spoke before me, that when we think about developing a framework about science communication education, we need to look at multiple disciplines and experts in those disciplines to learn about what to teach when we teach science communication. Communicating about science. We do need to look at some real-life contemporary examples to observe how communication strategies evolve and who are the important participants. And these will be very important when we shape this framework and so that it can adapt to this ever-changing context within which we have to communicate science. since I'm also a part of the Think Labs that Sarah talked about, we have been looking at, what have been the global examples of similar exercises which are looking at frameworks for SciComm education. And before concluding, I would like to, point out that these studies have realized that, customized skill development courses are going to be very important for specific career paths. But there will be a need of a conceptual coherence between all science communication courses. There are some essentials of science communications that needs to be part of all courses, whether, a person wants to go and make podcasts, or they are going to be a communications manager in a research institute. And I think those learning goals, learning goals for these courses should be identified based on global studies and then contextualized for India. And there is a need for science communicators to acquire competencies beyond technical skills. I will conclude with something that I've been thinking a lot because of my conversations with, my family, friends who have nothing to do about science, children of 8 to 10 years of age, and surprisingly also people who fund research and development, and people who pay taxes, right? So the questions that I'm sure all of us often get are, हाँ वो सब ठीक है लेकिन तुम करते क्या हो? And questions like तुमको क्या चाहिए? Okay, when you're trying to ask for money. So what I have been thinking is that should a training program equip scientists or practitioners with a worldview and also skills that will help them answer these questions? Thank you. Thanks, Usha.
Thank you, Shirley. In fact, that's the question, right, that we've all been asking about this worldview. And I think we've had a range of ways of thinking about the question of, how does one engage publics of various kinds, society, in these questions of science and knowledge making. I think the answer differs depending on whether you look at it as a public engagement project, or if you look at it as building critical literacies of some kind project. And I just want to throw that question back at the rest of the panel in terms of, how do we need, clearly in my mind, we're not separating these things. I think public engagement, the route to public engagement is, of course, critical literacies. So who does that, how they do that has been really what we're all struggling with. And in your experiences, I'm wondering what the roadblocks have been. Have they been from the establishment of science as we know it? And again, just acknowledging what Janvi said, science is all forms of knowledge building. It's not just what we take as the natural sciences or the so-called hard sciences, but all forms of knowledge building. So yes, what are the roadblocks? Are they in the establishment of, the formal establishment of knowledge production, or are they elsewhere?
So I would, if I may.
Yeah.
I think the roadblocks are really, at the end of the day, if science is, if we accept that science is a social enterprise, then all problems that are endemic to our society are going to show up in how science itself gets organized, right? And so in a sense, social transformation at various levels for different reasons needs to accompany this, right? Why are we able to maintain the cultural hierarchy of knowledge producers, right? Why are we able to maintain the superiority in the hierarchy of otherwise, rewind, erase. Why are we able to maintain the superiority in a society where stratification establishes certain hierarchies of those who have knowledge, those who don't have knowledge, and the indignity that comes with not having knowledge, right? Or not being able to acquire that knowledge. So for example, 98.9%, if it doesn't allow you to get into whatever, or your cutoff rank at JEE, gives you the indignity of not being, considered capable of doing whatever it is that you actually set out to do. And never mind that your rank gets you electrical engineering or IT or whatever, and your interest might have nothing to do with it, right? Like offer similarly for medical schools. So I think larger sort of, so the biggest roadblock really is how we think about knowledge, what upward social mobility means to us, and what we expect from ourselves in a way, right? And unless that fundamentally gets reorganized, any amount of band-aid work is not going to help. And therefore, what I said earlier, Usha, you accused me of being radical. I take that very seriously.
It's a good thing.
No, I know. I absolutely. There was some sense of irony in it. No, this is not, radical, because if the thing is, as I said, I said in a slightly flippant way that as a result of which we're producing bad historians and bad physicists, there is some truth to that, because we have political scientists who continue to teach political science as if Cambridge Analytica did not happen. And we have sort of gender studies talking about reproductive rights as if stem cell therapy and other things are not happening. So I think there's a problem. The problem is just much larger, right? And I think hierarchy is really, to India's detriment, the problem that is going to continue to come in the way. So that to my mind is the biggest roadblock. And why would someone who's been given cultural authority cede it without any protest, right? I'm comfortable. I might be a mediocre scientist, but I'm comfortable. So why would I give up my position, right? So I think that is, and of course it's a problem to which there are no obvious and quick and evident solutions, right? It's going to be an extremely long-term process, and it will probably happen long after I die, but I think we have to in a way work towards it, and we have to do what we have to do in order to dismantle some of that, move some of that. Because I do feel, the average age of my current team, for example, is 26. Students, of course, are always younger. So in the university, it would have had no meaning to say that the average age of my class is X, right? But in a work situation, it makes a difference. And I see both among the men and women, there is a readiness to change, because this dissatisfaction is at so many levels, including sort of, the irresponsibly handled planet, the irresponsibly handled gender question, other social hierarchy questions, including caste and, other forms of stratification. I do feel that we can sort of move things despite the bleak situation we find ourselves in. But it will take work. It's not going to happen, despite us. I think it will happen because of us. And, so it is a roadblock. The roadblocks are not that science communicators are missing. The roadblock is not because public engagement opportunities are missing. The roadblock is not because public engagement budgets are small. All of those things are true. But the bigger problem is really, do we believe that, everyone deserves to know? Do we believe that everyone deserves to tell us what research needs to be done? Why are we, but I think Sarah asked that towards the end, which is, why are we doing this at all? Why science communication? Why does it matter, right? Why do we want to, why bother? And then if the why is answered, then everything else in a way kind of, you just do what you can along the way. I know it's a slightly despondent answer, but I would rather have the despondence than the cynicism. Because otherwise, that's very hard, right? Because it's a fairly hopeless situation, right? It's so sad to have young people kill themselves because they somehow can't compete. What kind of a ridiculous situation is that?
Yeah, also to not fall into the trap of saying, okay, it's a larger socio-cultural, political, economic problem. Of course, one acknowledges that, but also trying to couch the drivers of change inside very pragmatic packages, right? So the kind of things that all of you are doing, which is instrumental in some ways. Okay, this is the objective of this particular public engagement project, but within that you also have this these tweaks to the frameworks that we all bring to knowledge. So the acknowledgement of inequities, the acknowledgement of linguistic hegemonies, the acknowledgement of indignities of, various knowledge systems, of the hierarchies of various knowledge systems and so on. So it's a not a philosophical question, it's a very real question, but one that we can only address in the short term by including those questions as subtext to the practical skills, techniques, those sorts of things that we deliver. So yes, I know, Somdata, you have your hand up, please.
Thanks, Usha, because your segue is really really useful bridge for me to connect with what Janvi was also saying. So I would just want to comment on what I have seen with how the older scientists and the younger science students approach science communication. And I do not look at it as a roadblock. I look at it as a question of what motivation they come with when they're engaging in this activity. So when I see older scientists doing this, there's a sense of charity that they do this activity with. And on the other hand, when younger people are doing this, many of them, or rather most of them, are doing this because they have realized that they want to do something with the scientific knowledge that they have, but they aren't yet sure what that thing would be. And this activity lets them deep dive, introspect within themselves of what avenue their scientific understanding and knowledge opens up for them. And in that sense, then it moves beyond this charity where they're doing things for others and moves into a paradigm where they're doing it for themselves, for their own growth, for their own introspection. And I think that is the change in the young people that, at least I find it to be a very positive change.
Yeah, no, that's a great point that you make, because I think to move away from this whole altruism, we have to educate the public, but to come at it from a self-interest, which is also tied to social or planetary interest in some ways. Yes, would any of the others like to come in on that point? Sarah or Teja or Shuli?
Just in terms of the roadblocks, if I may, or Sarah, did you want to say something? Did I jump? Right. So no, also the opportunities, once the hierarchies and the walls that separate these groups also sort of perpetuate even after career paths are set, and so it is harder. I think it's also a question of those spaces where people can sort of try and reconnect with what they thought was their initial motivation to get into science, perhaps, or it may not be an initial motivation. They come, they read, they meet other people, and they want to do something new. And where is the opportunity or the space to do something like that, right? So those, I think, so that is where perhaps there is a role where there is. I mean, it may just be an intellectual space. It may not be a building or something, but so where people can come together and have those opportunities. That is, I think, that is the primary roadblock, in the sense that once you speak or you read and you think and you want to do something different, but there is no opportunity, right? There's no space, or or at least the group is too small and you don't know how to sort of join it, right? So that's one more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that finding one's tribe is always part of the problem, and once you find a small tribe, you can also interconnect. But Prajval has a question. Would you like to unmute and speak, Prajval?
I'll go after all the others have done, because it's not directly related to what's being talked right now.
Yeah, Sarah and Shuli, would you like to add anything on the roadblocks? Yeah, Shuli, yes. Yeah.
Go ahead, Shuli. I'll go at the end.
So, for me, even when I'm listening to you and when I'm preparing for anything, be it a lecture for students or somebody who has nothing to do with science or research, it becomes a task for me to prepare in English first. And then if I have to speak to children in a government school that is close to my home, again, I'll need fivefold more preparation because I'll have to speak in Odia. So I think, being able to just speak in a particular language is something that I see is a huge roadblock. So when we go to a scientist to convince them to, give a lecture to the college, to the city college, they would always say, I think we are investing a lot of our energy on convincing the funding agency to give us funds. We also don't want to, invest tenfold more energy to prepare for a talk, which is has to be in the language that we are not comfortable talking in. So language is something that I see as a huge roadblock, and I really hope we, learn to come up with ways to work with that.
Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, and I completely echo that sentiment. And I also feel that a lot of the engagement work that I have done, language has always been a huge problem. I think we're not trained to communicate science or the ideas of science in our own, mother tongue or regional languages. So I think that's definitely a very important area that we need to look into, and should not be an area of handicap. And especially if we want to include, more people and be, more inclusive and all of that. I also just wanted to say that I think, I don't know if it's a roadblock, I don't know how to tag this, but I think a lot of young people are getting into science communication without really understanding what the space is about or why they're in it. So while I agree with Sumdatta's observation that I think they are a lot more enthusiastic, they see value in it, and all of that, but I think because there are also lack of other opportunities with a science degree, and I think because in India we've not really framed what science communication really means, why we should do it, and how it should be done, blah blah blah. I think it becomes a very I think stressful situation to be in if you're a young person, and you may want to contribute, but then either you fall out or you enter science communication with very different ideas, and you're faced with something completely different. So I think again, I don't know if this is a roadblock, but I think this is something that perhaps professionalizing the space or defining the space would help us. And I don't think that we should just have one definition or just one idea of what science communication or public engagement should be or can be, but at least there should be that sort of collective understanding and dialogues. I think more dialogue and more sort of thinking around this, so that we're able to at least sort of give it some sort of shape and form, and speak in a, I think
not common tongue, but some way that we can be understood. Yeah, maybe Esperanto is the key,
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah. Prajval, would you like to come in?
And I actually was responding to Jahnavi's comments in her main commentary more than what's currently going on. I think if one thing leapt out for me in this whole event, it is her comment about how the artist community have learned and do art critique as in the normal course of things, whereas science don't do it. So since you're looking for sort of practical things that can be done, I mean, how about a course on, how about starting courses on science critique? I think that would be just so, just the fact that you would start it would itself be something that I think makes people think, especially scientists, practicing scientists think. So, I mean, I didn't have any practical suggestions to give you when I made my comments, but I think what Jahnavi said really leapt out at me. So thanks, Jahnavi, also.
Thank you so much, Prajval. Learning from what stuff people like yourself have done before us.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the whole discipline of STS kind of, or the interdiscipline as they call it, is about that. But the problem is that scientists rarely engage with STS scholars. So I think
they don't have to, right?
They don't have to, but in the sense that who is if they are the object of critique, then they should also be consuming that critique, because like art critics are.
They will, once it starts having impact, they will.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And science, technology, and society, that phrase just doesn't convey it. I mean, some of them might be critics, but that phrase just doesn't convey it. Conveys something that, some fluffy stuff that. But if you use the word critique, like I think in art, they do use that, right? That's part of that would be the course title.
Yeah.
So then that would have a different kind of
more power, perhaps. Yeah.
Oh, somebody can critique science? So really?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in some ways, just the dialogue between the first panel and the second is interesting, that in a way, all the scientists on the first panel were actually engaging in a critique of their science and their establishment to some extent. So maybe that's a start, right? There are scientists who also engage in self-reflection. So just to kind of make that much more apparent would be the point. So I guess we are pretty much done, unless we have any last comments or any responses that any of you would like to make to each other. And then I can just ask.
I just wanted to add, if I may, especially about STS and how it becomes a whole other language with its own jargon and with its own, and then it sort of disappears into a separate wormhole, essentially. So yeah, so no, that's all.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, because when I do my science, I have suffered from this, sort of not knowing what to do with a course that is called Science Communication and Journalism, because you cannot do both in one course, of course. And so when you start with critiquing science, and then you tell these young people who are going to be journalists, okay, but you still have to cover science, they're like, okay, but we don't believe in it, so how can we cover it now? So yeah, it's tough, but but thank you all so much for engaging, for being patient, for engaging with each other and with the questions. So hopefully Shrestha and I will make some sense out of all this and write something. We will, of course, circulate it to you all so that you can take a look and see where we can go from there.
Thank you very much for organizing this. Really, it's like Sarah said, there isn't a community, and you yourself said, or like Prajval said, there isn't a critical mass. So I think, India's the only country of its size that doesn't have a professionally organized history of science society or a sociology of science society. And that's really, or the equivalent of an American Association for Advancement of Science, so on and so forth, right? So I think infrastructure around science is just completely not there.
Yeah.
And for a country that in a way creates its identity around its accomplishments in science and engineering, it's really kind of, it's scary. So I think it's really nice that it's heartening, not nice is a bad word. It's heartening that a community is coming together, and all of us of different stripes can work together with a very similar motivation. And for that, I'm really, I'm really grateful that there are all of us to
exchange ideas with.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
By the way, I don't think DST will fund a course, which if you call it critique of science, but
we can try. We'll have to find the language. Yeah.
Put like the word critique as in like QUE, make it like very French. Right? Like,
or rather make it peer review.
No, peers. We are not. I mean, they wouldn't consider a historian of science a peer of a physicist, man.
Yeah, no, not a peer. It has to be outsider.
I mean, my self-esteem aside.
No, that's what I put a comment. We accept peer review, but if comments comes from society, what will be the response of a scientist? That also we will have to discuss.
Yeah, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? Like there are enough things happening around us.
Yeah, it reminds me of that article, I forget who wrote it, about opening up the doors of science, right? About how bakers used to you used to be able to see into the bakery and now you don't. And it's the same thing with science.
Museums, right? Like earlier, when people studied natural philosophy and natural history, which is where from disciplines emerged, people walked into museums and saw what was being studied, and we've gone so far from that. Of course, I'm not saying we can return to that. It's not going to be possible. But that relationship, right? Like, it's an important one.
Even surgeries. So, yeah.
Exactly.
So that's even more gory, you would think. Yeah.
Okay, well, great. I mean, obviously, we can continue to talk. So maybe we should have another meeting to do that. Yeah. So thank you
so
all.
much for the opportunity.
No,
thank you.
thanks.
And lovely. This was really great evening for me, at least. Thank you so much.
Yeah, same here. Thanks a lot, Usha and Shrishta and everybody. Really enjoyed it. Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank
you. Thank you.